Story 1. I work in a cafe, and dealing with loud and noisy children comes with the job. That's granted. However, dealing with entitled parents and bratty kids who show no respect for the workers or the space is where I take major issue. I've got too many of these stories and could be writing for days, but this one still makes me smile. I'll call the mother Karen and the kid the devil. Unfortunately, these people decided to make our little backstreet cafe their regular spot. Karen was always loud, trying to talk to other tables while waiting for takeaways, and just being arrogant and not giving people space to enjoy their meals. The devil had no manners whatsoever, basically walking up to the barista and demanding a hot chocolate, never in an inside voice that would be silly. So, anytime they came in, we knew we were up for it. One day, we saw Karen trying to tie her dog up outside. It was a young Labrador about 12 months old and the sweetest pooch around. All the customers and staff then saw her kick her dog because it wouldn't stay still so she could tie it up. Side note, we have dog parking out front with clips, as a lot of the regulars have dogs and swing past to get a coffee on the way to the park. The poor pooch was just being friendly with another dog. Any reasonable person would have let them have the interaction, and then, when it's calmed down, tie it up. But not Karen. She felt she was in a hurry and needed her coffee 30 seconds earlier. Needless to say, we were all gobsmacked. Everyone was cold to her when she walked in, but Karen, being Karen, couldn't read the room and proceeded to be obnoxious as always. And right in tow behind her, the devil immediately demanded his hot chocolate in a big cup this time because apparently he's a big kid now. The next day, a coworker saw her coming and warned us as they were handing out takeaway orders during COVID restrictions, so a lot of people had to wait outside. I peeked my head around the corner as Karen started crossing the road with the cute doggo and the kid. At the same time, another person was walking around the corner with their dog, so Karen's dog decided it wanted to play and darted across Karen and the devil's path, inadvertently tripping both of them. As Karen was too involved in her phone, she went straight down onto the pavement, also taking the devil with her. Her phone smashed to pieces, and I heard a few subdued laughs. I really had to contain myself. She quickly swore loudly, and the devil was wailing as well. Needless to say, she was embarrassed as ever, and there was a good audience to enjoy it. The next day, I saw them walking in the neighborhood, and lo and behold, the devil now had a cast. Karma is definitely a witch. Story 2. Some years ago, I started working for a heavy industrial manufacturing company. I lucked out and got a great supervisor for a boss named Joe. The work was hard, working 12-hour days for 13 days in a row, and then a Sunday off before going back for another 13 days. I was young and didn't mind. It helped my wife and me save up for a house. After about 6 months, Joe noticed I was picking up on the work pretty fast and promoted me to a group leader position. This came with a raise and increased responsibility that most other workers didn't want. Joe would put me in troubled groups in his department, and I would work on general improvements and figuring out the issues. This was a union shop, and the mentality was to just put in your hours. Don't work harder or smarter. Just do your time and don't kill the job was the unspoken motto. After a few years, Joe was promoted to a manager, and he transferred me with him to his departments. While I wasn't a supervisor yet, I was the supervisor in all but name. The supervisors loved it because they never had to leave the office, and I liked it because it was a good learning experience. I made a good reputation and got a lot of respect from workers and management. Eventually, Joe's areas were doing so well he was promoted to plant manager. As before, he wanted to promote me with him, this time to a supervisor spot. We talked at length because the only supervisor spot open was working for Karen. Karen was female and a minority. She was the poster child on the company website of inclusiveness in the workplace, literally. Her face was the one they used. She was also a freshly minted manager, and Joe was not confident in her abilities. But me, being the plucky go-getter with a can-do attitude, decided to take the position. I had to interview with Karen and got to meet some of her supervisors. They were very quiet and reserved. Once I was promoted, I worked in tandem with another supervisor, Chris. Chris was young, had one small child, and his wife was pregnant and a stay-at-home mom. During the first week, everything was going well. I was learning about all the employees, getting to know the process, and getting a feel for the area. During the second week, Chris's wife went into labor, and she had a hard time. Chris went on paternity leave for 6 weeks, and I was tossed into the deep end in charge of the whole area solo, with 60 employees. I was barely treading water but doing my best. When I would ask Karen for guidance or assistance, she would scoff as if it were beneath her and tell me, "If I have to do your job, then I don't need you." So, I gritted my teeth and worked my tail off. My wife got me a smartwatch, and I was averaging 25,000 steps a day trying to keep everything running. We were holding our own, and employees did what they could to help, as the situation was not ideal for anyone. A few weeks in, I was reviewing some quality documents and noticed that one of the quality gates was not being followed. I emailed the info to the quality engineers, and they lost their minds. This was a 4-hour operation on a 20-hour part that we were skipping entirely. It turns out, one of the reasons Karen got promoted was because she was running her department so efficiently. Then it came to light that she made the decision to skip this quality process, saving that 20% of time. However, the engineers never signed off on this, and it caused massive damage control. The process had to be reinstated, and the parts that were never checked had to have warranty extensions. This caused the company to have egg on its face and made Karen look bad. During this time, Karen also became more vindictive. She would openly tell people she would never be fired and could do what she wanted. She would walk the departments, and if she didn't like someone, she would make the supervisors write them up by the end of the day. She wanted us to find a reason, and if we didn't, she would take it out on the supervisors. For example, she would force the supervisors to stay late to do inventory or something else menial just because she could. She would not let the supervisors make any decisions until she approved. So something like overtime had to wait for her approval, and she would not respond until the end of the day, causing the departments to scramble. Then, if there weren't enough overtime employees to do the work, she would blame it on the supervisors. While the supervisors knew this wasn't right, we all needed our jobs and tried to do the best we could for Karen and the employees. We were mainly rodeo clowns to Karen being the bull. The first day Chris was back, he and I were both pulled into Karen's office. She started berating me on how poor of a job I was doing, making her look bad, and how I never came to her for help. This made me speechless because of the previous comments she made and the fact that supervisor work was beneath her. After the meeting, I was still a bit stunned, but I put it together that she was about to railroad me out of the company, and this was the first step. I called Joe and asked for a meeting that same day. When I got together with Joe, I started telling him about the things that were going on that he had no idea about: the harassment, the abuse, the vindictive nature. Ironically, while I was speaking with him, another supervisor called him to complain about Karen as well, with the same grievances. Joe was stunned and said he would speak with Karen, but he gave me carte blanche on any open spot in the company starting the next day. He really didn't want to lose me. I did a lateral transfer to a different department doing engineering at work, and I thought that was the end of it. A few weeks later, I was leaving work, and Karen mentioned that I never turned in my laptop and phoned to her. I told her I didn't know I had to, but that I could give it to her tomorrow. She smirked and said she would get it back soon enough. I didn't think too much of it at the time. After about 6 months, I had my review with my new boss, Jake. The review went great. He was very happy with my work and was a bit surprised at how fast I picked up things. At the end of the meeting, Jake mentioned offhand how Karen tried to intervene in the review and get me fired, but Joe stepped in and squashed it. "Okay, Karen, now you've ticked me off." After I left Karen's department, the turnover rate went through the roof. The supervisors were quitting at a rate of one every 3 months. Keep in mind that this is a legacy company that had multiple generations working: fathers, mothers, sons, entire families. Some areas had 3 generations working side by side. And yet Karen was rolling over employees and supervisors like a steamroller. Working for her became the kiss of death. I casually mentioned to Joe about the turnover, and he told me he couldn't figure out what was going on. People were quitting without notice, and no one was doing exit interviews. I told Joe that Karen was writing people up to force them out. When they would hand her the resignation letter or 2 weeks' notice, she would tell them to leave immediately and throw away the letter. Then, she would tell Human Resources that the person quit on the spot, and that was the end of it. Joe told me that because of who she was and how high she was in the company, they wouldn't do anything to her until they had an airtight case. So, I went to work. I took the supervisors working for Karen out drinking after work a few times a week and made sure I had my hand on the pulse. If someone was quitting, I made sure they emailed their letter of resignation to Karen and copied Joe and Human Resources, stayed for their exit interview, and called the company integrity hotline for good measure. Things were progressing well, and I had all the supervisors on board except Chris. Chris really needed the job, and Karen was not writing him up. Through a stroke of luck, I found out Karen was lowballing his raises as a cost-saving measure. That's why she was not harassing him. When I told Chris, he was furious and wanted to quit on the spot. I encouraged him to speak with Joe before he left. Joe and Chris had a very productive meeting, and Chris decided to stay. Now, all the supervisors were on board. Joe brought in a human resources bigwig from the headquarters in Kansas, and over the course of a week, each supervisor was sent in for an interview discreetly without Karen knowing. By the time the interviews were over, they had emails, texts, eyewitnesses, and a mountain of evidence. This next part, I heard from other people, human resources, Joe, etc. Despite everything, the company wanted to keep this quiet, so they brought in Karen and said they no longer needed her and offered a very generous severance package. Karen, being Karen, lost it on the human resources people, threatened to sue for discrimination, and even called a lawyer. That's when the company pulled out the stack of evidence and rescinded the severance offer. After a few months, Karen found a new job as a plant manager in a different factory, and I found out where. I casually mentioned to the union reps at my factory where Karen was working and suggested that maybe they should give the union at the other factory a call. She was fired within 3 months for employee harassment. Last I heard, she had to sell her house and move out of state to find a job. Story 3. For reference, I've spent 15 years of my life being a restaurant general manager. I've got some crazy stories. Anyway, I was reminiscing lately, and this story came up. It was Mother's Day, one of the busiest days at my restaurant. Quick service, self-seating, casual dining. An entitled mother already ordered, had her buzzer, and was waiting for a table to open. She saw another family get up and immediately ran to the dirty table to reserve it. No big deal, right? Just needed to bus it. The entitled mother saw the deaf employee and began yelling at her from behind, so the deaf employee didn't notice anything at all. The entitled mother continued to berate and follow the deaf employee. Now, I understand that there is no sign saying my employee was deaf, but I believe a normal person would realize that something was off after getting no acknowledgement at all. I noticed something going on and walked over to the already irate entitled mother and asked if I could help. She went off about the deaf employee ignoring her request to clean off the table and help her family sit down. I apologized to the entitled mother and explained that my employee didn't respond to her shouts because she is deaf and genuinely had no idea anyone was trying to communicate with her. I signaled one of my bussers to come clear the table while I continued speaking with the entitled mother. This is when the entitled mother accused me of lying about my deaf employee. She demanded to know why I would hire someone who couldn't respond to her shouts and demands. I was getting very annoyed at this point. I explained that I didn't need to justify any of my hiring decisions and that I 100% stood behind my team. The entitled mother began demanding that I fire the deaf employee. She said there was no use for a deaf person to work in a restaurant. This got me fuming. At this point, her table had been bussed. Her kids were sitting looking quite embarrassed, and her buzzer was going off, informing her that her food was ready for pickup at the counter. To me, there was no reason to continue with the entitled mother, especially on such a busy day. I asked if she needed help picking up her food, and if not, I wished her a good meal and excused myself. The entitled mother was not done with my team. She again saw the deaf employee restocking some items and decided to prove me wrong. She approached the deaf employee and again began berating her using very offensive language. When the deaf employee turned to face her and realized that she was being yelled at, the deaf employee was frightened and confused. I never allow my employees to be harassed, and this was especially evil. I immediately had my expo counter pack the woman's order to go, handed it to her, and told her to leave. The entitled mother called me a very rude name and told me she was going to contact corporate and have me and the deaf employee fired. Yeah, okay, like I've never heard that before. I escorted her and her poor children to the door and told her she was not welcome back into my restaurant. Side note, in case you were worried about the deaf employee. She was crying and so confused by this situation. I sat with her in my office and explained that this had nothing to do with her and she was an amazing employee, which was absolutely true. She worked with me for over 5 years and was the first deaf employee to be a certified trainer for her position. I still keep in contact with her, and she is genuinely such a special person.